G'day everyone and welcome to our final video for legal studies. We've gone through 4 areas of study through Unit 3 and Unit 4, and we're finally up to 4.2 for 11, which means our final annoying quote that no doubt most of you skipped through. But this is one that I really love. Really try and remember this as much as possible daily if I can, and that's that your self-worth can only come from yourself. A bit of self-love, you know. If we're constantly looking for external validation, we're looking for other people to tell us that we're good, we're looking for other people to give us worth. You're taking everything out of your control. So your self-worth can only come from yourself. Bit of self love, you know. Think about the things that you like about yourself. Find time in your day, in your week, particularly at this busy time of year as you're starting to think about exams and starting to study for those. Find time to do the things that you enjoy. Find time to do the things that make you feel good. And you'll find that, hopefully your self worth improves along with that because ultimately you are the most important person in your life. So, our introduction, we are looking at 4.2.11, as I said, and this is looking at 2 specific referendums, 1967 and 2023. So, both referendums regarding Indigenous Australians, one successful and one unsuccessful. And we're going to use these, so including in relation to past and future constitutional reforms, we're going to use these to be able to discuss the ability of the Australian people to change the constitution. So discussion, how much ability do the Australian people have to change the constitution versus what limitations are there on that. At the end of this, you're going to be able to really explain what happened in two referendums involving the proposed changing of the constitution, and you're also going to be able to have that discussion. You're going to talk about how much ability we have as the Australian people to change the constitution. So the first referendum we'll look at is 1967. So the 1967 referendum, it's often called, and you can call it if you need to, the Aboriginal People's Referendum. And the 1967 referendum did 2 things, and I'll go through the 2 of them here. So this is Section 51, Clause 26, and this is before 1967. And we know the start of Section 51 is, hey, the Commonwealth has the power to make laws for the peace, order, and good governance of the Commonwealth with regards to the people of any race other than the Aboriginal race in any state for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. So the Commonwealth can make laws for anyone, specifically any people of any race. Effectively, the Commonwealth can make discriminatory laws if they want to, special laws if they want to, targeting a race because of this clause of the Constitution. But it did say this. Other than the Aboriginal race, so other than Aboriginal people. So the Commonwealth was prohibited from making laws to do with Indigenous Australians. So think about things like the Indigenous Affairs portfolio, um, you know, initiatives like closing the gap and any legislation surrounding that. All of these things stem from the ability to make laws specifically for Aboriginal Australians. And prior to 1967, that was expressly prohibited by the Constitution. So the proposal was to remove that restriction, remove that prohibition, and as a result, broaden the Commonwealth's lawmaking powers by getting rid of the restriction. It would now just say that the Commonwealth has the power to make laws with regards to the people of any race for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. So you can make laws for people from any race. This was also a section of the Constitution, section 127, and it said very clearly, in reckoning the numbers of people of the Commonwealth or of a state or other part of the Commonwealth, Aboriginal natives should not be counted, aka Aboriginals were not counted in the census. So they didn't count towards the population of Australia. And this impacted things like representation, because then you're not, counting them in the distribution of electorates, etc. But it also essentially came from that, you know, drafted in the 1890s, the Constitution, that's a highly discriminatory notion that Aboriginal natives weren't people. Aboriginals were subhuman and therefore shouldn't be counted in the population of Australia. The proposal was to remove it, just to completely remove Section 127. And if you read the Constitution today, you'll see it goes Section 126 straight to Section 128 because this referendum was successful. So the impact of the referendum being successful was, it was the most successful referendum that we've ever had. 90% of voters voted yes. And we've just come off talking about how difficult it is to achieve a referendum, how historically they're almost impossible. Even the ones that have passed have been in the low 50% often. And then all of a sudden you've got this one that's just like, bang, 90% of people voting yes. This is a poster from that referendum, May 27, 1967. So what was the impact of the referendum? Well, as we know, that restriction was removed. So we removed a restriction that meant the Commonwealth could now legislate for Indigenous people in the states. It meant that they could start directing funds towards Aboriginal affairs. As I said, it impacted distribution before that. States couldn't get extra seats in Parliament if they had large numbers of Aboriginals. Funding for Aboriginal affairs, so initiatives like Closing the Gap, housing, health, education, etc., justice, all these things that the Commonwealth could now do targeting Indigenous people because they were no longer restricted from doing it. It allowed them to set up an Aboriginal affairs portfolio, which we still have to this day, and have an Minister for Indigenous Australians and Aboriginal Affairs Minister. Ultimately, all of the initiatives you see in society now from the government around attempting to improve outcomes for Indigenous Australians were only possible because of this referendum in 1967. So why is it significant? So here's a little bit of the detail. What is the referendum? What were they trying to do? Hey, remove a restriction from Section 51 and remove Section 127. Why is that significant? Well, it's significant because of this overwhelming support. It's significant because only 8 out of 45 referendums have been successful, and this one was like hyper successful. It's the most successful referendum we've ever had. So it shows that, or illustrates that, if there is broad support for an issue, if the right referendum is put forward for the people, then referendums can be successful. It did also alter the division of lawmaking powers between the Commonwealth and the states, a little bit marginally, but it took a residual power because the Commonwealth was restricted from legislating in that area and then made it concurrent. So now the Commonwealth and the states could both legislate for Indigenous Australians. And it allowed Aboriginal people to be counted in the census. And this was around representation, but also righting a moral wrong. So this is very much significant in the sense of we're updating the Constitution to reflect a modern society, right? So it's significant in that it illustrates or demonstrates that we can update the Constitution to reflect the views of a modern society. That if there is bipartisan support, because there was with this, so was bipartisan support, if there is bipartisan support, and again, the issue is right, there's no case put forward, the people are ready for it, referendums can be successful. However, we can't get away from the fact that referendums historically have not been successful. And this is where we're going to talk about the 2023 referendum. So the 2023 referendum, very recent, and in addition to the study design this year, and probably one that you hopefully know a little bit about because it was in the news a lot last year and you were doing year 11 legal studies and you were hopefully interested in this stuff. And we go from a referendum to do with Indigenous Australians, back to 1967 here, and you'll see here the case for yes, and there was no case. There was no case presented, not formally anyway. We go from this, the most successful referendum in Australia's history to do with Indigenous Australians, to the Voice to Parliament referendum in 2023, which was very unsuccessful. So this was the proposed change. So if you're asked to outline a little bit of detail, because you need to know what the 2023 referendum was, this is what was proposed to be added to the Constitution. So we hopefully know that the Constitution currently ends at section 128, which is the method for altering the Constitution. And the proposal here was to include or add a new chapter to the Constitution and add section 129. And this chapter would be chapter 9, Recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I want to really, really highlight this idea of recognition, because if you're talking about what was the purpose of the 2023 referendum, the idea of recognition is a really vital part of that. The 2023 referendum was trying to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as the first peoples of Australia. Okay? Putting it clearly in the Constitution, because Aboriginal Australians are not mentioned in our Constitution at all. Not a single mention. They were mentioned up until 1967, but in a discriminatory way. We removed those discriminatory references in 1967. But now Aboriginal Australians are not in the Constitution at all. The thought was that we would have a referendum in 2023 and we would go from, pre-67 discriminatory references. We remove the discriminatory references and we just have this neutral Constitution that doesn't mention Indigenous Australians at all. And that post-2023 referendum, we would actually include Indigenous Australians in our Constitution in a really positive way. So we would recognise their history. And, Voice to Parliament sprung from the recognition movement in Australia, the Recognise movement, which wanted Aboriginal Australians added to the Constitution. So the proposed addition, Section 129, was about recognising that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples are the first peoples of Australia, so symbolic, but then also a really practical addition, that there will be a body created called the Voice. And the Voice will make representations to Parliament and executive government, so Parliament and government, on matters relating to Aboriginal people. And the Parliament, so what would usually be in Section 51 sort of stuff here, the Parliament will have the power to make laws with respect to how that body works. So what we were trying to do, really twofold, if you're asked to explain what the 2023 referendum was about. Well, it was about, one, recognition of Aboriginal Australians and Aboriginal history in our Constitution, and then two, establishing a voice to Parliament, establishing a body that could make representations to Parliament on issues affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So they're really two key things that you're talking about when you're explaining this referendum. So what would have the impact been? Because with 1967, we looked at the impact because it was successful. So what was the impact? This is much more what was the proposed impact, because obviously the referendum wasn't successful. So what the proposal was hoping to do was enable, as we said, the Commonwealth to create an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Parliament would have control over the voice, how the voice operated, who was on the voice in terms of how people would be selected, what that process would look like, the extent of the voice's powers, how it would sit, when it would sit, what its composition size would be. As I said, how members would be elected. So Parliament would decide all of that. The Constitution would positively recognise Indigenous Australians for the first time. Um, and if we're talking about the lead into this, the proposed impact, well, 60% of Australians supported this idea early on. 60% of Australians were keen for this to occur in early polling. 60% of Australians were supportive of recognition and supportive of the concept of a voice. But by the time we got to voting, 39% voted yes. So the yes vote, dropped by a third. 20% of voters, more than 20% of voters dropped away. And some opinion polls even had it as high as 65% wanting to vote yes at one point. So we're talking close to it halving the vote. And no state, or all states were no states, because no state had a majority yes vote. So the proposed impact of this was to create these things. And then, so that's very much the proposed impact. And then this was the result. Initially, really positive polling, but then that dropped off dramatically. So, what's the significance of this? Well, the significance of this is the 2023 referendum really highlights all of those factors from video 4.2.10. It highlights the difficulty of the process. It highlights that even when it seems like something is popular, double majority is incredibly difficult. Only 8 out of 45 have passed. Particularly when there is a no case. As soon as there is a no case, as soon as there is a lack of bipartisan support, a referendum is effectively doomed to fail. The coalition, the opposition, didn't support the change, and they actively campaigned against it. And this is a cartoon, so it's showing the role of the media in this as well, because the media had a really big role then in pushing forward both campaigns, but, you know, pushing forward the no voice as much as the yes voice. And this is, like a cartoon that was in The Age from Kathy Wilcox, where it's Peter Dutton saying, hey, like, Albanese's trying to trick Australians. He's trying to trick Australians into making life less miserable for First Nations people, whereas I'm upfront and transparent about my self-serving political reasons for prosecuting the no case. And this is putting forward that idea of what I mentioned about in 4.2.10, that potentially opposition political parties like the coalition in this case, but Labor oppositions in the past as well, see political benefit to pushing a no case, a political benefit to campaigning against it, because if the referendum fails, it allows the opposition to put forward the idea that, hey, this government isn't very good. They wanted to get this referendum through, and look, they wasted all this time and all this money. It's estimated this referendum cost $400 million. They wasted all this time and all this money on something that they couldn't even succeed with. Maybe we're a better alternative. So the significance of this again is that it shows the lack of bipartisan support, that it shows that there is even political benefit to the opposition opposing a referendum. It also demonstrates that idea of clarity, how important clarity is. One of the major arguments the No campaign put forward in this was that there was a lack of detail. If you don't know, vote no, was their main slogan. If you don't know, vote no. Really amplifying the idea that there's no detail to this. You don't know how this is going to work. This could be a negative for you. If you vote yes and vote this through, we don't know how it's going to work. It's unknown. In 5 years' time, this might actually be detrimental to your life. All of a sudden, that fear of the unknown, the lack of clarity, the you know similar themes to the 1999 Republican referendum, where it's like, oh, how will this actually operate? How will the system change? How will this work? We don't know. Led people really down the path of being like, well, maybe we'll just stick with what we've got now. Um, and as a result of this, so really a significant outcome from 2023 is that some scholars have been like, hey, we might never have a referendum again. You know, the Constitution's drafted in the 1890s. Like, it was drafted when cars didn't exist, horses and buggies. But it's near on impossible to change. And maybe even when, this issue that supposedly had broad public support when it was decided that we would have a referendum, by the time we had a vote, that vote was down to 39%. Maybe there's no point having referendums. Maybe there's no point changing the constitution when there's other ways we can work our way around it. Um, and this is not a new theme post referendum. In 4.2.10, I talked a little bit about the referendum to abolish the Communist Party from 1951. And when the Labor opposition campaigned against that referendum, and it failed, and Robert Menzies was the Prime Minister, he's a Liberal Party Prime Minister. And he actually had a quote along the lines of effectively getting a positive result from a referendum, getting the public to vote yes in a referendum is one of the labours of Hercules, aka it's practically impossible. And here we are 74, 73 years later, effectively saying the same thing. So when we're talking about significance of these two referendums, 67 demonstrates that successful referendums are possible. If the support's there, you can get it through. If everyone's on board, but 2023 demonstrates the darker side of that, that if not everyone's on board, if there is a lack of clarity, and demonstrates that it's really, really easy to push people towards a no vote, particularly if you can get the media involved, get a bit of misinformation. And yeah, that no message is really amplified as much as the yes message. So our key skill here is a discussion, and as we know, a discussion is an exchange of opinions. And here we're discussing the ability of the Australian people to change the Constitution. And we have to reference past and future constitutional reform, which we should be able to pretty easily. So, how able to change the Constitution are we as the Australian people? Well, straight up, and I'll go back to the question in a moment, but let's just consider how able we are. Well, we're not able at all, really. Let's think about it. Because referendums rarely occur. We've only had 45 in the last 120 something years. The coalition often has other ways of achieving what they want from the change. The referendums are expensive, they're time consuming. Um, Parliament might have other priorities, government might have other priorities. Referendums aren't likely to be vote winners. You know, you're much more likely to win votes talking about cost of living, which is the big goal at the moment, because he lives. You're much more likely to win votes, unfortunately, talking about things like migration and immigration and crime, security issues, as opposed to, you know, talking about changing the constitution. So Parliament really unlikely to call for government, really unlikely to have as part of policy. They're expensive and time consuming. So we have little ability to change the constitution if we don't get the opportunity to. And Parliament has to give us that opportunity. It has to come through Parliament, through the Houses of Parliament with a constitution alteration bill. So do we have a great ability to change the constitution? No, we don't. But ultimately, if we do get a chance, we the people, the Australian people, ultimately decide whether a referendum is successful or not. Double majority provision, we vote whether we vote yes or no. is ultimately whether a referendum passes. Also, we can force Parliament to give us that opportunity. We can put pressure on them, lobby groups, organisations form around the idea of constitutional reform. There's an Australian Republican movement, for example, that's constantly advocating that we should change the constitution. Media and social media, people can push forward petitions, they can protest on the idea that the constitution should be changed. That might force Parliament to pass it through to give us that opportunity, which means we get the ultimate say. But we know that when we do finally get the say, referendums historically do not. So even if we do get the opportunity, which we're unlikely to, we're then still not likely to actually change the constitution. Double majority is difficult to achieve. Only 8 of 45 have been successful. People are generally conservative and prefer the status quo. And both a yes and a no case are presented to the public. And this can infer that both sides are equal and actually, misrepresent maybe how much need there is for a change. Because the only reason we're calling for a change is if the government feels like there needs to be a change. But then it's presented in a very different light publicly. But if there is bipartisan support, referendums can be successful. And 1967 illustrates this, that if everyone's on board, if the change is clear, if the change is 67 is a simple change. Hey, we're removing discrimination. That's it. We're not altering lawmaking powers. We're not creating a new legal structure like the Voice in 2023. We're just removing discrimination. Simple, clear, lots of clarity, no case presented. That's how referendums are likely to succeed. 2023, supposed lack of clarity, which the government was pretty clear on, that the referendum was all about them having the power and then Parliament would negotiate on what it looked like as a voice. But the opposition was like, there's no clarity. We don't know what the voice will look like. It could be this big, scary thing that you're afraid of. And as soon as there's a lack of clarity, as soon as there's a lack of bipartisan support or a perception of a lack of clarity, people are likely to vote no. So, how able are we to change the Constitution? Let's say we got a question like this. Discuss the extent to which the Australian people have the ability to change the Commonwealth Constitution. Well, I would say that you want to put forward generally the view that we have a limited ability to change the Commonwealth Constitution. Yes, we get the ultimate say through a referendum. Yes, we get the ultimate say with double majority. But we have to get that chance first. And when we do, we're not very good at taking it. So, do we have a great ability to change the Constitution? No. 2023 showed that. The other 36 unsuccessful referendums show that. But 67 does show that in some limited, narrow circumstances, change is possible. This is a great article from the ABC, talking through the idea of will we ever change the Constitution again post the 2023 referendum defeat. I'd highly recommend having a read. But thank you for being on this journey. Thank you for getting yourself through to the end of Unit 4 Area Study 2. Congratulations and well done. You now know 2 referendums where the Constitution, or whether it was proposed that the Constitution was changed, but you also know a whole lot more. You know the whole legal studies curriculum. Hopefully you know it. You've persevered through year 12, and hopefully you're ready for exams and then to move into the next chapter of your life. Remember, prioritize time for you. Your self-worth can only come from yourself. Find time to do things that you enjoy. Find times to have a break from the busyness that is life. And happy studying for your final SAC and for your exam.